I think we will.
All right, just let us know.
Okay, welcome. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, this is part 3 of 3 events that are surrounding the Preston Thomas Memorial Lecture. I'm Andrea Simic, the director of the B.Arch program and a faculty member in the department. This afternoon I have the pleasure of introducing our 3 participants in the panel. The first person you all have spent quite a bit of time around. That's Jacques Herzog, who is the centerpiece of the long banquet table to my right. And we have also Peter Eisenman, who is to his left. And Peter Eisenman is an alumnus of our college, our department rather. And he also requires no introduction, but I will just do a brief one for those of you who are maybe new to the scene. Peter has advanced the discipline of architecture with theoretical texts and exceptional buildings of profound consequence. His critical redefinition of architecture as a language and mode of thought has influenced generations of architects and educators. In 1967, he founded the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, where he served as director until 1982. And as an aside, last night, Jacques discussed Gordon Matta Clark's work and his time that he spent here at Cornell. And Peter was just sharing that he had curated an exhibition through the Institute entitled Idea as Modeled that Gordon Matta Clark participated in, and maybe Peter might want to talk a bit more about that. Mr. Eisenman is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He was awarded the Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement at the 2004 Venice Architecture Biennale, and in 2010 he was honored with the Wolf Foundation Prize in the Arts, awarded in Jerusalem. He's currently the Charles Gwathmey Professor in Practice at the Yale School of Architecture, and his academic career has spanned many institutions, of which we are proud to say Cornell has been one of them as well. He's also a prolific writer, and I guess most importantly, he holds his Bachelor of Architecture degree from our very own. Let me move now to the moderator of this afternoon's conversation is Carson Chan, to Jacques' right. He currently is working and living and residing in Berlin. He's an architecture writer and a curator. He studied design, history, and theory of architecture both here at Cornell as well as Harvard. Have you noticed a kind of theme underlying our panel this afternoon? He founded the program. He founded Program in 2006, a non-commercial initiative for art and architecture collaborations, and he has variously curated and overseen more than 30 international exhibitions of contemporary art and architecture. Including recently in 2012, the 4th Marrakesh Biennale, which he curated with Nadim Saman. And this Biennale presented newly commissioned works by more than 40 artists, architects, writers, musicians, and composers at 5 locations throughout the city. His writing on art, architecture, and contemporary culture appear in books and periodicals worldwide. And he is currently just completing his executive curator at the Denver Biennial, where he turned the city of Denver into a giant outdoor exhibition space. He is currently also working on and put together an ambitious symposium at Yale on architecture exhibitions. He also graduated, I think I mentioned that, but from our program in the early 2000s. And I just sort of made a note, I kind of appreciate the spanning of I think Peter's very proud of his date of 1932, Jacques 1950, and Carson 1980. So I think it's a pretty interesting span of generations of architectural thinkers and makers. So with that small and simple, straightforward introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Carson Chan to sort of start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you, students, for coming, Missing Studios. Thanks for the faculty. And again, Andrea, for the invitation. It's an honor to be sitting with this illustrious panel, but also just to come back to Cornell and see everyone. I'm exceedingly honored. As you may recall from last night, Jacques' incredibly generative and generous lecture. I'm sure we're all still wallowing from the images and kind of ideas that he's been kind of talking about. Peter, who doesn't need any introduction at all, except for just looking through the internet, it's kind of riddled with superlatives. The most influential of American architects, the most intellectual, the most avant-garde, but also the most prickly, the most divisive, and the most polarizing at the same time. We only have about 45 minutes to an hour to discuss together, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So about 5 years ago at GSD with Jeff Kipnis, the same pair spoke already once. But at that time, the main kind of atmosphere was one of consensus, which is kind of surprising because the two of them, both giants in their own right, occupy very different parts of the architectural world spectrum. And that perhaps is sort of what I think would be more interesting to talk about rather than how you're similar. And Jeff Kipnis last time talked about you're similar, and it's a very kind of almost mundane thing to say, but you're both similar in the way that you both tried to exceed simply just making buildings, which is actually more than you can say for most architects, but that was a similarity that he started out with. I guess it was, so it's been 12 years, I guess? No, 10 years since I was last here. But 12 years ago today, I guess, was a pretty strong moment in my architectural experience. Anyway, 9/11, 2001, when Nazreen convened the whole school in Sibley 152. And I don't exactly remember, but somehow we watched the clip together. She said something about life, having to go on, the school going on. But it struck as a particular moment in which architecture or buildings was something that I realized was something that we all invest symbolically, socially, financially, historically. And at this point, I think the social role of architecture, not just the design of buildings, became a very important thing for me to think about, and something that definitely Jacques spoke a lot about last night. So maybe just starting with Peter. During the question-answer period last night, Jacques ended with a pretty impassioned call against theory, or more accurately, the instrumentalization of theory for design. And to quote Peter, though, in sources I've found, he says, "I don't think architecture can be anything but top-down." From a kind of a concept down to the building. The way it is, but what we heard last night, the way it's experienced is exactly not top-down. Your early houses from the 70s really kind of were about themselves, and not so much about, let's say, the comfort of the occupants or the living conditions of the occupants, but they famously, were the kind of result of logical manipulations. Columns would kind of go in the middle of tables. There were holes in the ground. The Wexner Center columns kind of like didn't touch the ground, and beams didn't support anything. What's kind of interesting for me right now is that you have a huge commission right now in Turkey, in Istanbul. That's about 3 million square feet as a kind of urban redevelopment project. 1.7 million go through this place every day. So the kind of, in terms of the social role of architecture, what was possible in these small houses for 1 or 2 people living there, I can understand. How do you sort of deal with these two very different dynamics, thinking about the architect as someone that top-down kind of like pushes an idea or design, and someone that has to deal with the very many different publics that are in existence?
Okay, Carson. First, I'd like to say I want to thank, in a sense, Jacques for asking me to come back for round 2. He forgets that he was supposed to have round 2 at Yale with me, and so now he owes me 2, because he's taking home court today. I want to say something about Carson's introduction. What made Punch and Judy shows great for kids was that there was a Punch and there was a Judy. I guess I'm supposed to be the Punch in this program. I don't feel like a Punch with Jacques. We agree on too many things, but I'll try and and keep to that format. And the final thing I want to say before I say something about Istanbul, and I got to be very careful because they watch the internet. I've lost commissions saying things about clients. There's a phrase, there's an elephant in the room that we all know, but in this case, the elephant is the room. And I think you all should be aware of that. Maybe not so much for Jacques, but it's an elephant for me. I think Carson has a very underdeveloped idea of who my client is in Turkey and how Turkey works. We would love to meet the director of the museum or the people who are going to work in the museum that we're designing. I think if we push that too far, we'd be out of the job. I don't want to tell you how payments work in Turkey or how you get contracts. Let's just to say that Turkey is a developing country, and I don't think you've been following the Prime Minister much recently. If you think that there is anything but a top-down institution in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, whatever. I think the concept of pluralism, democracy, is problematic at best. That doesn't say that I am definitely on the side of top-down design. I believe design, why are we having these people here if not to become experts at what they do? Clients are not experts. That's why they hire experts to do architecture. I don't believe in group thinks. I don't believe in BIM. I don't believe in parametric design, where there's design alternatives in the process. I do believe that what makes Jacques the architect, I believe, whatever he might say, or whatever Rem might say about suddenly he's interested in the environment, I find that totally wacko. I cannot be anything but honest that I don't feel good working on a project where I don't have written into my contract, I have the final say on design matters, even though they're structural engineers, environmental engineers, consultants for museology, libraries, etc. Unless I have the final word, I'm not doing my job, and I don't feel good about my job. And I am, at my age, pretty expert. I'm faster than my students. I'm faster than most of my assistants. I don't mind saying so. I have to be faster because I ain't got much time. Thank God I'm faster. So, social, environmental plan. Look, we've been there before. Jane Jacobs and all those things in the 60s. I'm a generation before Jacques. There's no sense in me rehashing those things. Jacques can say what he wants about clients, and maybe that's true. The lecture I heard last night, which was a fascinating lecture, was working with artists, and which the interaction between artists and architects, which I've been through. I know, for me, the difference between an artist and an architect, and I worked with Richard Serra on the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, and we met with Chancellor Kohl at a very famous meeting, and Kohl said, here are the kinds of things, he went on, we thought it was going to be 10 minutes, he went on for 2 hours telling us about, and suddenly Richard Serra interrupted him and said, listen, I've heard all this before. I don't compromise. You want my work? That's what it is. No bureaucrat is going to cut my work. And with that, Cole reared up and said, Mr. Serra, I am not a minister. I'm not a bureaucrat. I'm not a secretary. I'm the Chancellor of the German Republic, and I won't be talked to that way. And he blew Richard Serra right out of the room. Now, architects do have to listen, right? They listen a lot. Sculptors and painters don't have to listen. They listen to nobody, right? And I worked with Michael Heiser. I've worked with Michael Haneke, a filmmaker. I've worked with as Jacques has worked with a lot of those guys. They're tough guys, and Ai Weiwei ain't no different, right? And I don't think people tell Ai Weiwei what kind of thing to do. A lot of clients have requirements that we have, as a profession, have to listen to. You work within those constraints. I am not an artist. I wouldn't know how to become an artist. I'm fascinated by film, as I am cooking, but I'm not a chef nor a filmmaker. I'm an architect. And so architects do listen to the clients. Now, the real interesting thing is, who are the clients? In most cases, in the work that's going on in New York City right now that I think that Jacques is involved in, I could be wrong, because the client is not the user, by the way. The client is a developer. The developer is the only one that has the resources, because in late capitalism, cities don't have the infrastructural capacity or the social structural capacity to provide for the public domain.
Would you agree with that, Jacques? That the client is the developer or the city rather than the end user?
Well, it's not the city either. It's the developer mostly.
Right.
That's, as you say, Peter, I agree actually in most of the things that you say. Unfortunately, that's pretty boring for the audience.
Sorry,
art is art.
I didn't mean to.
Art is art, architecture is architecture. I don't want to come back to what I said yesterday. For us, I tried to explain about this energy and this radical position I found in art, but I didn't find in architecture, and that was a very important moment for us at the very beginning of what we've done. Today, late capitalism, I think that's the right word. It's true that everything basically is in the hand of developers, and the client has disappeared, and there is a certain danger that also the architect disappears, because the client is a key thing for the architect. Otherwise, you just become a decorator of the developer's kind of intentions. But I nevertheless, this thing about ecology and especially about social structures, I strongly believe that this is a very important element, ingredient. If you mentioned cooking, I went to school with Lucius Burckhardt, who is, of course, Jane Jacobs, this kind of generation of thinkers. And his theory, or the theory of these guys, is really theory because that's their medium. Unlike architects who use theory of words as a medium which is actually not theirs. That's why my criticism, that's another thing we could discuss, is always sort of coming back to this question of what medium do we deal with. I don't think that we should be so moralistic and say all of a sudden, oh, I'm so much for bottom-up discourse, bottom-up design. Of course, the artist and especially the architect also has to, at the end of the day, control the design and has his intention and his thing. The question is only how can you achieve that, and how can you design things. Especially, I didn't mention that yesterday, but a lot of the projects we can do now, and I guess also you, Peter, are so-called important projects in important cities, large-scale projects, and the importance of public scale is fundamental for the success of the project. And if you don't do the public space right, which is in the case of the Tate, the Turbine Hall, the Caixa Forum in Madrid, many other projects now have a kind of an inserted public space that was not included in the brief. And we're very much interested in that, giving that to, I don't want to sound moralistic, to the society, but to the people, so they can use the building and make sure the building stays and is an important part of the city. And this is something that you don't learn at the school. And this is something which is also not always successful. This is something that also needs intuition, or needs all things that normally you associate with an artist or with an architect. This is something that you cannot, you can also not parametrically develop this or whatever. This is part of your experience, your knowledge. But I think it's important to communicate this. So communication is also to do with this idea of bottom up. Why do you do what you do? And at the end of the day, you do the building. And if the building, and that's what I said yesterday also, independently from you or from me or from whoever did it, if the building doesn't work and only the people decide whether it works, then you have failed, then you have lost the battle. Whether it was done top down or bottom up, that's then a different story.
But that's the point I think I wanted, that I started with, wanted to bring up, is that you said in the end it's the building that remains. If people don't like it, if people don't use it, it's not going to remain. So it could be made out of any theory you want, any kind of set rules that you want, but unless people use it, it's not going to be a building. So I think that's the difference between bottom up thinking about it and top down. I mean, so you bring up the question of communication, which I think is really important, because in the end, the building is communicated to the various publics that use it, particularly large urban projects, irregardless of who the client may be, I guess. But could it be that the difference between this bottom up experience, first, the primacy of experience kind of way of thinking versus a much more top-down, hierarchical, kind of theoretical rigor that Peter is kind of pushing, is kind of a difference of vocabulary. One is, I guess you're using, you work with surfaces, materials, differences of reflectivity, rainwater, you talked about yesterday. Whereas throughout his long career, Peter has been talking about different logical, kind of syntactical, spatial manipulations that are validated through kind of like theoretical and historical kind of ideas. How these things get communicated to the general public that use it, I think, could that be the difference between you guys, as understood through the communication?
I don't want to make that. There are plenty of differences that we could talk about. I mean, we could talk about materiality, for example. Materiality is much more important to Jacques and his work, and I understand that, than it is to me. Why is that? Because there's a fundamental difference philosophically, which is important to underline, not good or bad, but Jacques is more interested in phenomenology. He comes from a northern aesthetic, like Johanni Pallasmaa and others in that, Norberg Schultz, etc. He's not a southerner in that sense. My whole background in architecture is southern. Much more interested in the possibility of non-material, let's say. In other words, I study Alberti. Alberti was the first architect in the history of architecture to define space as an important category, all right? And I think you could say the whole history of architecture since then has been, how do you define space? I mean, how is space defined? Space has no color, has no material, etc. And I think, to me, the important thing about this place is its space, not its material presence, not how people are able to see or hear. That's what the elephant I'm talking about. I'm certain if you gave the people a survey and said how many of you participated with the architect on what you wanted, you would have less than Anthony Weiner got in New York. But I mean, I don't think that's an interesting argument. I think the interesting argument is Jacques last night articulated that he was of a northern mentality, okay? And I think that's a really interesting phenomena in terms of how he treats material. And I think material is treated differently in the northern world, as opposed to spacium, the Latin for space that Alberti found, in the Italian world, let's say, and in the architects that I'm interested in, from Alberti to Palladio to Luigi Moretti, Tarani, whatever. I find the northern guys get me really nervous, okay? And they may get him nervous too. I mean, Johanni Pallasmaa gets me totally squeaky. And so does Norberg Schultz. In fact, my dissertation, which this student was having, was written against Norberg Schultz at the time, because his book, Intentions in Architecture, had just come out. I needed some foil, and he was a great foil. My total alter ego, not this guy, is Peter Zumthor, right? Who is Mr. Material. In other words, he's interested in corners, how things go together, the graining of things. I mean, which is fabulous. But forget the social. We're talking now about architecture. Zumthor's idea of architecture ain't his, nor is it mine. And I think that Jacques is somewhere in between those two situations. Maybe not. I would say Jacques is much more concerned. I mean, I could take Jacques around and look at the corners of this building, which I think are horrific, and he and I would agree, right? By the way, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but Rem doesn't give a shit about corners. I mean, to be honest, he doesn't.
But Peter, let me say a few things.
Sorry.
I think I mentioned that the northern and the southern tradition. The north is interesting in, for me, I call it the romantic position,
Right.
which is in fact the idea of a holistic dream of bringing all things together. And I'm very fascinated by that, by Novalis, by Goethe, ultimately, much more than those that I mentioned, and especially Norberg Schultz and the other people. There's a more diluted version. I disagree. Space is not a purely abstract phenomenon, because space needs material to be created. Otherwise, it's purely just in your mind, which is fine. That's an interesting idea. Even Alberti and Palladio needed material, and very finely treated material, to make that space available, you know. Other architects that you mentioned make it like a kind of a magic, you know, which I find horrible, honestly. This kind of exaggeration of celebrating something, I couldn't imagine to be seen in such a corner. But yes, I think space, like we human beings, and that's why architecture is made by and for human beings. We are physical. We have all these senses, and architecture is interesting when it responds to all these five senses, which is also smell and touch and everything. At least for me, this is great. It's like eating, like drinking. All these things are great because it involves material. I don't make it an obsession, because I don't care about materials in that I prefer this or this or that. I don't give it a value. I just give a value to the finished space. And Alberti was perhaps the first who wrote about it. But the interesting spaces, the evolution of space, is something that worries me enormously. I visited India not so long ago and found the concept of space, and also pre-Columbian South America, they didn't know what space was. They filled up space like if you slice your body, you find always another piece that is filling up the space. There was no idea of the space as an abstract idea. But the Muslim came, more importantly than the Latins and than the Romans and the Greek. The Muslim have, in fact, invented the space in the most amazing spatial concept. If you think of the first mosques, even pre-Ottoman mosques, you know, with the vaulted thing. So the space comes as much from that corner that it comes from the Greek Roman side. And space in this case with the Muslim architects, as much as with the Italian masters of the 14th, 15th century, 16th century, was always connected with this space, with also the sound that space is making, and also the precision that you were missing the precision. I didn't see anything, but I can imagine that Probably it's difficult to get the details right if you do such complex forms. But this detailing and the precision is again, let's say, interesting because it comes close to a very abstract idea, because it's almost mathematical precision, and that's probably what fascinates you, and that fascinates also me. This total precision, if you look at Michelangelo's library, this kind of amazing piece, which is both abstract but also very concrete, very physical. And I'm very fascinated by that. I
see
would say.
you guys are
But I
agreeing
mean,
again now, which is
Jacques, let's go back, because let's talk about painting for a minute. You mentioned, I mean, I took my students 2 years ago from Firenze to Volterra, a 3.5-hour bus ride to see Rosso Fiorentino's deposition, right? And we sat in front of Rosso Fiorentino's deposition for 2 hours, right? It's one of the most, for me, stunning paintings in the world. You mentioned Holbein. For me, one of our differences would be Rosso Fiorentino and Holbein.
But I'm not against Fiorentino. I love Italian painting. It's not this or that.
No, but there's a difference between Holbein. You can't like everything.
No, I like quality. But I don't think it's necessary to make these juxtapositions. I could also say Leonardo. Leonardo, for me, is the greatest of all times, in every sense. And Washington, D.C. has this most amazing painting of the Annunciation, you know, where he depicts the place where the wing touches the body, this kind of impossible junction. He was interested just in where this hurts. So this is, for me, beyond North and South, and that's ultimately...
I like the Vermeers in New York. I always go to the Vrick to see the Vermeers, so it's not just North and South.
But I think, but I'm curious to know when, as a student, or, when you were even at the ETH with Rossi, this is when Peter was making his abstract little houses. What was your reaction to that, or what was the kind of ETH reaction to these projects?
We were really fascinated by Rossi. I mean, as a student, hopefully you have the same experience, that you really like your master. And Rossi, he was then in his late 30s, early 40s. He was a young, charismatic person, and his very early work we loved a lot because, as I said, we found it close to arte povera, and plus he was a communist, and that all the students had this kind of left-wing.
I know, to Peter's work.
No, we of course we knew it. We knew what happening in America, but it was less, let's say, in the foreground. We really had these two. We had Lucius Burckhardt on one side, and then we have had Rossi. Only later, the kind of New York architects became really an issue. But that was already when we started our own practice, so it was never really something that I embarked on. I got to know Peter more in the 80s and later, and so it was not, this early work was not something that we were so consciously dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you mentioned, I think last night you mentioned the architecture of the city and complexity and contradiction is two really important, which no question. They changed architecture in 66, 67, it's absolutely everybody. But I think the important thing is there's an enormous difference between what Venturi was saying and what it meant, and what Rossi was saying and what it meant. Even though they were both important, the consequences is what I'm interested in, not whether one was a communist, one was a capitalist, one was, the important thing was what is the evidence on the ground, right? And unfortunately, I would agree with you that Rossi's late work is not like Modena and Galaratese and et cetera are brilliant evocations of a brilliant guy, and success has a way of corrupting. One of the things you always wish for success, it also is as it did to Jim Sterling. I mean, you mentioned it last night. Jim's early work was stunning in its simplicity and its attention to detail, etc. And I forget the Stuttgart take the Kunstwissenschaft in Berlin is a horror, I think,
Yeah.
And
I agree also what we say about Rossi and Venturi, but also for Venturi it was difficult to bring to put it down on the ground. There are actually few buildings which are at the same level. I mean, but that's also why I'm so critical about writing. It helps you, it PR somehow, prepares the terrain. They were highly influential, but really, now the students who read that, this is purely historic information and it doesn't help you, and hopefully it doesn't help you develop your ideas. For us, Rossi was interesting because, I mean, when I say a communist is not, but we loved communism, but it was like a way for us to accept a designer who did architecture, and this is his main message. Architecture is architecture, do building, and express your criticism through the work of architecture, not as an independent disciplines. And I think that was a good statement. By the way, and that might be interesting also for you, Galaratese was, I visited Galaratese in 72 together with Aldo Rossi, and it was, I think, finished around 71 or so. Yeah. And I went back about 3 months ago. And it was restored, and I had it in mind almost like a built version of the Chirico, of this kind of almost surreal facade or idea of the city. And it was fragile and poor and was fascinating in this open landscape 40 years ago. And now it is restored, and it's well restored, but it's, now I have to say something really negative. It's as bad as it used to be. Because, this idea of the slabs that touch the ground were meant to be filled with public life, with social life, to have people in Italy. If it doesn't happen in Italy, it wouldn't happen anywhere. To sell fruit or vegetables or something. But the truth is, it's totally empty. Nobody goes there.
Because it's a middle-class neighborhood.
It's also workers. But it's also, the space is not inviting. The space is thought theoretically, is the expression of an ideology that he has, very much more than, hey, how do people really move? And I think that's what I meant by what you have to think of, how people would use that space and then make it yours, make it your concept. But then it's again a kind of a top-down, but if you haven't gone through this bottom-up understanding of what people are, you would always fail as an architect.
Wait a minute. I want to make sure we're still on the same page. Just because Galaratese doesn't, like the Louvre, doesn't work as a palace today, it's a museum, right? Just because Galaratese doesn't work as a socialist model of, or Red Vienna doesn't work as a socialist model, doesn't take away from the value at that time of those things.
But I think the idea is it does, in fact. If it was meant to be very social, used.
But the social has changed in Italy. There is no left in Italy. There aren't people who.
But political system aside, I think there are, you can see Rome. A lot of places that have been used continuously for thousands of years. It's just if it works, it works.
I think that's a very important point, because I think you do a building, whatever it is, a temple or a Colosseum, whatever, was then transformed into a private house or a palazzo for the Pope. A great building will always be based on a very strict and clear program, a brief, and if it works when it starts, it will always work later, also when it's transformed.
So what should we take away from, what should we learn from Rossi? Is it the books, or is it the buildings, or does do the ideas in the books, because they've been used so instrumentally in the building, cancel that out?
Well, the book, without the book, let's say, we wouldn't have looked at those little white houses of Le Corbusier, because there were a lot of guys, Mallet-Sévans, Gouvrecki, and Leusat, making little white houses in the 20s. Corbu wrote a book, Vers une architecture, where Jacques and I might, let's say, have a disagreement. I think the people who wrote and built, the writing lasts longer than the building. I didn't say anything about the building. I'm saying is, we wouldn't look at Palladio, we wouldn't look at Le Corbusier. I don't think we would look at the elephant if he hadn't written Delirious New York, to be honest. That's another question. I think history will prove me correct that the 4 books, you go and see the Palladian villas today, it's not a lot of problems. You go and look at Venturi's mother's house today. You go and look at Galleratesi today. So, but the architecture of the city, complexity and contradiction, the Quattro Libri, Vers en Architecture, remain, I think, more important. And what I don't believe is that buildings are forever, books are forever, and we can disagree about that. Buildings are meant to be torn down, by the way, so other people can build.
So I think we can safely say that Jacques disagrees with that, but also just to continue to nuance how you might disagree.
Jacques knows that stadiums, because we're both interested in stadiums.
And you've both built very different stadiums too.
Well, Jacques and I both know that stadiums last about 30 years, the lifespan, because the change in the client, who's paying for it, who is occupying it, is so radical in sport that a stadium design in the 60s has no longer a validity in the 90s. And all the stadiums in this country, may not be so in Europe, certainly it's beginning to happen in England anyway, that are all torn down. There's not one stadium remaining that was built in the 60s that exists in this country, professional football stadiums.
But they were not built by architects. Those which have had at the beginning an important position, let's say the Olympic Stadium in Munich, in the 70s, we've certainly not been torn down, and I don't see at the moment how they would do this in Beijing. I also don't totally disagree, of course, about the book. I have to nevertheless say that I think especially those architectures that you mentioned that don't look so great as when you go back is perhaps to do because these guys spend too much energy writing unnecessary books just to promote their work.
You're a killer.
No,
You're the killer.
The truth is that I have never really learned anything about the building done by an architect through his writing. On the opposite, I like basically whatever I see or I'm interested in architecture, I just see through my own observation, and that's
why you're interested. You're a phenomenologist, and I'm a conceptualist,
Exactly.
and that is, and what is interesting, by the way, not that this one is right and one is wrong, but that to me that is the serious question for students today. In other words, is there a room? I mean, I thought we had beaten down the phenomenologists 50 years ago. They're back in the computer. In other words, the guys that you would really hate are the phenomenologists of the digital.
Yeah, but I'm not a phenomenologist.
You're interested in phenomena.
I'm interested not in phenomena. I hate phenomena. I'm interested in what I see. Not in phenomena. I'm not interested in ideology, but I'm interested in conceptual thinking, which is based on my own observation of the things. And I think I spoke only about concepts yesterday.
You did, but I mean,
so it's not so easy to put people in a drawer.
I wasn't putting you in a box.
And I think it's very, very important to state that. I think the only way to survive is always through the concept and not through ideology. I think that's the only way you can use your intelligence and your creativity.
But I think that, having seen many of your presentations, I guess through YouTube, oftentimes you use words like concept or ideology or even phenomenology, and you mean very different things. And without having to kind of like spin out exactly what you mean, I guess maybe we'll find out over the course of the presentation. You said something really interesting about 2 minutes ago, that the value of architecture is in the finished space, which I think is a good way to sum it up. But there are many activities that you've done, and I guess this question can go to both of you guys, that you've done, Jacques, that point the other way. For example, when you brought architects from North Korea to Munich to talk with them, with Rem, in the Haus der Kunst, basically hit the gallery, the museum that Hitler built. This, I would say, kind of superseded the whole premise of bringing North Korean architects to Hitler's museum, superseded the architecture or the built thing itself, the finished space itself, I think. So that's an interesting moment that I would love to hear more about. And also just simply, I guess, working in China, the difference, how the question of politics, and I guess we started that way a little bit with Turkey. But I don't know, maybe you can talk a little bit about how politics, separated from space, separated from the experience, plays a role in your practice as well.
I think that's a very complex question, and as a consequence of what I say, that whatever you have to say, whatever you think, is like petrified in what you've done. This is also of course true for what happens in North Korea or what Hitler did. And strangely, this Haus der Kunst that we were dealing with together with Rem, we were trying to reveal the history and understand what, and how it's put together. How can you build ideology? That's one thing, and certainly you can, through very simple description, trace back all these ingredients of where fascism tried to find a way to express their kind of, you could say what in proportion, in materials, in forms, etc., etc. The same is right for Stalinist urbanism, where scale, of course, and proportion are a major, very clearly driven architecture from which you can learn a lot. Then there is another thing, especially when you go to the Haus der Kunst, I'm sure you have visited this building. Everybody who sees that, it's somehow frightening to go in that building that still is there, and you cannot see that building without all that, so you never have a neutral or an objective kind of approach to this building. And of course, with bringing this guy from North Korea there, this was an attempt to duplicate that moment almost, to see this man that we all know through this one building and through. But it was relatively uninteresting. It was just an anecdote somehow. And I'm a bit ashamed you mentioned that, because we would have needed to say, so what? Why do we do this? But it was, of course, very clearly also the question, why would Munich keep that building? Why would Munich use that building again for an art gallery and again for a social space? Because before, it was used in Hitler's time as a museum and as a social space, to organize parties and things like that. So it would have been interesting to see what, why they use it in the same way. But they masked it. All these fascist, this kind of show-off, the stairs were cut back, so it wouldn't have the same gesture. That it was like mutilating. And strangely, both Rem and I, we were in favor of at least bringing back how it was. So at least you could see that, because I found it very coward and stupid to make it more democratic, or to make it look less what it is, and to have these trees in front, like pubic hair or so.
But I think, first of all, to talk about the architecture of Nazi Germany is an extreme example. The Haus der Kunst, or the building by Speer for the Chancellery in Berlin. I think these are radical examples, and certainly Leon Crier's defense of these is, to me, very radical today. I think Italian fascist architecture, is really a different story, and was always, fascism in Italy was not as extreme, etc. And the buildings, frankly, that remain in Milano, in Napoli, of the fascist era, are quite good buildings. They're not inhabited by this craziness. And so I think one has to take these things, each one on their own. Absolutely. By the way, I don't think that one can say that. I've been wanting to say something. I've been sitting mercilessly here because I want everybody to take a picture in their camera from this position of that wall, right? And of what this space. And you see at least 4 or 5 different grids operating at one time. The grid of the rake of the staircase, the grid of the glass, the grid of the ceiling, the grid of the columns. And to me, it is unthought all right? It just is. And that's what worries me about the perception of just phenomena, because I know Rem is for all of us a great architect, but I ain't sure that he cares about whether that's that way or not. It's that way because that's the way he thinks about putting things together in what he would call a very ordinary, banal way. I mean, it's not the banal of you. Your interest in the banal is a very different banal.
That's true.
And his is very different. So I think we have to. I'm not uninterested in looking at phenomena. What I'm interested in is when we try and make people stand up for phenomena that they're not interested in. The architect who did this vista could care less about my experience of it, etc. Honestly.
But this is, in fact, based on a concept, because also Rem is very conceptual in his thinking.
Right.
But this is a lack of precision and control.
Right.
Simply because you should know the concept leads to certain things. And then the next step, and this is also architecture, is about taking care. And here we are again with bottom up. I think taking care is fundamental for an architect. And otherwise your ideas will leak out. So in order to be, this is not out of modesty that I ask for being careful. This is, on the contrary, it is because you want to convey what you wanted to do with your concept, and it needs a rigor and a precision. And that's not all, or that's very rarely coming together.
But can you have, see, I would argue that the Rem of today is not the Rem of 30 years ago. Can't be.
Well, I don't think we should talk about
No.
people who are not.
No.
I mean,
No, you know what I mean. I mean, you can't have that control.
I mean, before we go on, with ideology and phenomenology, I think maybe the example that you gave with Taranye and also with Speer, we spoke last night about how, because I was at this talk with Mark Wigley, Chris Durkon, you and Rem, and Mark kind of mentioned that the swastikas on the ceiling of Haus der Kunst, you just take away two of the little arms, and then all of a sudden it's a different pattern altogether, and it completely kind of takes away all the power of that symbol, and I guess it shows kind of the fact that we're using that building still, the fact that Taranye's kind of ideas can be morphed into all these different things, shows perhaps the weakness of ideology in the face of form. But I guess that could lead me into a question about intentionality and how intending form to be a certain way, and what that means in the end product. So if we talk about the memorial for the murdered Jews in Berlin, there was a very conceptual kind of idea at first about how that how that happens, how that is kind of organized, how that fits in the square. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, Peter, how it started with Richard Serra, but also your reaction of about how it's used now. Kids are there, they're playing there, people are jumping all over the place. It's anything but solemn as a kind of memorial for murdered Jews of Europe.
Well, first of all, I'm very ambivalent about solemnity. I'm very ambivalent about memorials. I think the memorial we have in downtown Manhattan for 9/11 is horrendous. The scale is wrong. The feeling is wrong. I thought of the project as architecture in the city, as a space in the city where kids could jump around, where people could sunbathe, they could have lunch. I was trying to take something in which 20, 30 years ago, which is when we did the project, was taboo in Germany. In other words, to talk about your role in Nazism, as Ungers never did, as Günter Grass never did, etc., because it wasn't the time to do it. I think it's great when Hans and Fritz go home to Grandpa and say, hey, we had a great day. We had a field trip to the Holocaust Memorial. We ran around and played tag. And the Holocaust Memorial becomes part of the everyday in Germany. And I think when the Holocaust becomes part of the everyday, we've done something to, in a sense, not forget it, but neutralize the horror of it. You go to the camps and you can see it and you say it's terrible, but you, in a sense, psychologically can reconstitute yourself. What's interesting about the memorial is the space of the memorial you can't really reconstitute. I mean, it's a problematic space. It's smaller than your kitchen. It's smaller than two people walking abreast. And so it's the space that causes feeling in the Holocaust Memorial, not that it has insignia to the murdered Jews or inscriptions or anything like that. And so for me, the success of that is that kids are playing as they run around in Catholic churches, that people are sunbathing, that people make love in there at night. It is a profane space, but yet a space of incredible, intense experience. And I think that was what we had in mind, not anything else.
Let me also say something about this this piece, this public piece of architecture. I think this is truly a masterpiece, Peter. I really admire you for this. And I think it somehow contradicts your notion of space because it's really very intense, very interesting. I totally agree. It should be playful. It should be used for normal life and whatever life contains. But I think the space is so nice because of this materiality it has and also because of the floor of sand. I think this is really great because it's the floor of the city, the bottom of the city. I just don't like so much these kind of concrete slabs on the floor that are introduced.
But that's Berlin.
Yeah, they had to do that. If you remove that, it would be even more archaic and more timeless, in a very good way.
The sidewalks of Berlin are built of those tiles, and that's what we said we wanted. But when the crunch, because of the sand, the tiles are loose, and the crunch of the feet and the silence of the stones. Look, I would argue, I could draw you a diagram that says that it's just as much about space as Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House or Le Corbusier's Maison Domino. I could argue that conceptually those pillars define space between the ground plane, which is important, and the top plane, the top plane of the slabs, just like the pavillons, the Maison Domino or the Farnsworth House. They both are defined between two horizontals. The interesting thing here is only one of the horizontals can be understood because the roof plane you don't read because you're within it. And so I would argue that it is precisely within my conceptual discourse. It happens also to have an enormous phenomenon, touch. The feeling of the stones, the concrete, the color was really important to us. The kind of, we worked like hell. All of those things were carefully done. So I don't think it does disenfranchise, as it were, the thesis that went into it. And the only way we did it was we first drew, honestly, two planes like this, just woofing around, and then where the columns, the dots were skewed, the columns went off at a skew. Where the dots were over one another, they went up straight. So there is this...
I totally agree. It's very careful, but it is material. The quality of the space expresses itself through its materiality. It couldn't be done in plastic or in something. That's what I meant. So I'm sure great space is always associated.
Can I tell you something though, Jacques? Let's be backstory, right? I wanted to find a non-material material. In other words, I wanted auto body gray, which is the dumbest gray I could think of. Not black, not white, in other words, I didn't want a shade of brownish gray. And I wanted a material that was not stone. We were offered beautiful stone. We were offered slate, which is stunning when you stack slate up. We wanted non-material. So in the materiality that you talk about, which is there, you can't avoid materiality. But what I'm saying is, what you like about it is because it's not slate.
I think that's a very interesting point to discuss this issue of materiality. I totally understand why you wanted to avoid slate or any. It would be so ridiculous.
Yes.
But to do non-material materiality is very difficult because at the end, as you say, it is materiality. It is like the attempt of Ad Reinhardt to avoid any kind of figure. And when he did these black paintings, some of the most gorgeous attempts of painting in post-war America, he always failed. So whatever we do it is of course about failure. But you have to accept that fight, that battle, and it is to do with material whatever you want to avoid, to not give it a value that disturbs people or that brings them away from the idea of space that you have in mind.
But let's go back to your Don Judd and Monet analogy of last night. I would argue, because Philip Johnson, from my wedding present, gave Cynthia and myself an Ad Reinhardt, a black on black.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay.
Not so bad.
Okay.
Not so bad.
Not so bad.
Not so bad.
Not a big one.
That is amazing.
Not a big one. Yeah. And looking at the black on black is a stunning experience, all right? And I would say almost more so than looking at those Judd things. That Ad Reinhardt, and I always believe, honestly, that painting for me is far beyond sculpture because it's less literal and more able to open up to possibility. And I think Ad Reinhardt, he may not have been a success in terms of, had a very limited palette.
An amazing painting.
Yeah, but what a painter, right?
Unbelievable.
I mean, to continue a little bit with the, where we were going with the monument, I don't know if I really believe you, Peter, when you say that you intended for people to be happy and jumping.
Oh yeah, not happy. Oh, I didn't say.
No,
it's everyday life.
Everyday life.
Everyday life's
and
not
it
happy.
turned out, and then
everyday life's.
but it also turned out to be that way. You wanted it to be part of everyday life.
I did want that. Honestly, you have to believe me. I've said it in many, many occasions. It's written down. Giorgio Agamben said the best thing about the memorial that I've ever read. He said the memorial represents two kinds of memory. The archival memory, which is down below the field, where you see the actual pictures of the camps and the people and hear the names and all of that, okay? And then he says there's this field which deals with the immemorable, that is, the impossibility of memory in any form. And the Holocaust is one of those things that is impossible, and that the two memories are necessary, the archival to remember and the other to try to remember, let's say. And so I accepted that because I wouldn't have known what else to do because the enormity of the task is such that, Jewish groups wanted to put stars on the pillars. They wanted to put names on it. And we kept saying, no, none of that. And it's been very difficult to sustain that no. But the kids do jump around. They do take lunch there. They do sunbathe there. And I thought that's what we wanted to do.
But I guess the question is, so that would mean that the experience of the end user is somehow important in your practice, right? Or are we going too far when we say
you cannot control? See, this is where I disagree. I'm not a sociologist nor an anthropologist. I'm an architect. You do something. Which users are we talking about? The users in this room or the ones that'll be here 30 years from now? What I'm saying is, if you were to take a poll like the news broadcast, you don't get news anymore. You get polls of what people want to hear. We have too much information and not enough knowledge. I'm arguing that we got enough information about the Holocaust, but not enough understanding, let's say. And I would argue what we tried to do is limit information, okay? Consciously limit the possibility of information. We wanted, in a certain way, a certain level of banality, you know. And the pillars are all the same size. Why aren't they square? See, now, one of the reasons they're not square is because when you architecturally walk between pillars like this, in the long dimension, there's a different rhythm of boinky, boinky, boink. It's nothing to do with the Holocaust. But when you walk like this between pillars, there's a boom, 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 boom. There is a rhythm, the difference in the rhythm. That's why they're almost 1 to 3, because we wanted that experience of walking in one direction.
That's amazing, because what you're describing is experience. Is architectural ideas communicated through experience?
Yeah, but
which
not
is
for what the
phenomenology.
user, maybe the user doesn't even know that.
But they do.
Subliminally, they do.
But so, what would this Peter Eisenman tell the one that did the Aronoff Center in Cincinnati, where it had this extremely kind of rigorous kind of theoretical and logical kind of backing to create the different kind of crevices and tilts and everything, but the end result is when people walk towards it, they feel the ground is moving underneath them, they feel unbalanced.
Yeah.
So did you intend that physical experience as well, or was it much more kind of a result of?
When we did the convention center in Columbus, we did a tipped grid, okay, in a flat floor, just to see what would happen. And actually, people who came fell down. Some people actually got sick. We had to change the grid. We had to change it to rectilinear, right? I didn't intend people to get sick. I didn't intend people to fall down. I wanted, one of the ideas, we may disagree about this, I believe that to displace what is impossible to displace, that is where a person is and where they've been and where they're going and the experience, if we could displace that certainty. And I've always said that it came from when I was in an Iowa cornfield on a gray day. I was stealing some corn to have for dinner in 1952, and I'd walked 100 yards into the field, and I bent off 12 ears or something. There were 4 of us in the car, and tucked them in my shirt. And when I turned around, I didn't know where I was to go. And there was a moment of absolute fear, okay? Absolute, oh my God. And I think to achieve that in space is to displace certainty is one of the things I think architecture does. I know that's why I like Michael Haneke's movies, because you don't see the fear, but you feel fear in those movies. They're amazing, I think. And that's one of the things that I think architecture does. Whether Jacques would admit that, I think his architecture does. That's what we like about his architecture. There are moments when there is a displacement of certainty. And that's why we're together, because we do displacement of certainty differently. I don't write about it. You think I write about it. I don't write about it. I write about Alberti. I don't write about my own art. I don't know what I'm doing, okay? And no, any more than he knows what he's doing. We'd be the last person. I mean, I said to some people, why do you do that? And I said, ask Jeff Kipnis, because he makes a living out of telling me what I do. I can teach somebody, I can't teach them how to design, by the way. I can teach them how to become expert at using their whatever talent to understand what architecture is, but I can't create for them. I can give them the background to do that. And I think that's all we do as architects. We give a background to people's experience. And what we're trying to do is create a situation where that experience is as important as the what's being done in the space. That is, the space itself plus the experience. I've always been concerned about that, but I don't need to ask anybody or do a survey at all, because that's what I'm expert at. I know how to disturb people in a room, okay? And so does he, by the way. I mean, this isn't a new, we're not talking about Norman Foster or Skidmore, Owings and Merrill or Pei Cobb Freed. We're talking about Herzog and Demirone. What is the difference? It's an enormous difference. It has nothing to do with philosophy, ideology. It has to do with their spaces. No matter how he wants to describe them or I want to describe mine, their spaces disturb the status quo. Okay?
For I guess both of you guys, which space or building that you've designed would you say have communicated your ideas the best, and which has communicated the worst or least effectively?
This is certainly something I couldn't answer. There's just thing that probably survive better, and honestly, I'm not. That's sorry. I'm not interested in even knowing this, you know. And in this, I agree. You don't always know what you know. We are not machines that can so clearly anticipate. You know, of course, you try to not do things randomly. I mean, I think we both use our brains quite a bit, but I honestly couldn't say also what I like more or.
Let me.
I don't know whether you have this
I can't
awareness.
do it either. I want to say something about a current situation in their world, right? And that is the digital and parametricism. And I did an interview recently with Patrick Schumacher, and I said, in the end, Patrick, if they throw up these alternatives, the what parameters are, it's pure mathematics, okay? Ain't architecture, it's mathematics. Ultimately, to turn it into architecture, someone has to decide which one, right? You have to make a choice. And I don't care how much you use a computer to top up, top down. I don't give a damn about that. What they have to learn, I believe, what we teach architects to do that sculptors don't do, writers don't do, and that is how to see as an architect. That we can teach because it's not a natural given. It's a second sight, let's say. And the thing is that the computer can't see for you and can't create the answers for that. And to sit every day connecting dots with a computer is probably the worst fate in the world. I can't think of anything else that someone should do in my office or his office, sit and connect dots.
Greg Lynn did that in your office.
What?
Greg Lynn did that in your office. Huh?
Yeah, but look where Greg Lynn is today. All right? No, he sat in the office, but we pushed him out. My argument is be careful of the parametric because it's pure mathematics. It's not architecture. It's not sculpture. And I think it's important to articulate that, especially in this forum, where I think both Jacques and I would agree. I think Patrick Schumacher's a bright guy, but he's wacko when it comes to parametricism. And I think it's his architecture and Zaha's architecture has been hurt by the belief that, in fact, the parametric can overcome whatever, right? and I don't think it overcomes anything.
What's interesting, in what you're saying is the choices that we make, as architects, differentiate us from people that just simply make buildings.
Right.
Right. Which is interesting because both of you guys here, sitting here, are perhaps the most talked about architects right now in Germany. Peter for what we talked about already for the Holocaust Memorial, and the critique that continues to revolve around it, the discussion that it kind of brings up, and Jacques because of the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, and the kind of the unprecedented spaces that it'll offer, from kind of bringing the public space up into a building and then opening up into this kind of vista of the harbor and then up into the space of music, but also in the unprecedented, I guess, price, of the building itself, and the kind of questions in the press in Germany right now is like, is this worth it? Why are we making such an expensive building? What are we kind of cutting back? How much more taxes are we paying? What is being offset by the price of this building? So in terms of kind of ideas or kind of choices that we make as architects, how much do these other kind of choices factor into it, and how has it been kind of like a conflict, in your own thinking about architecture being something that should improve the lives of people?
With this, we open up a totally new chapter here. I think we try actually to make this a book about this whole story about the Elbphilharmonie, because I think it's the most radical example of the impossibility to do a building today in a democracy for the state. It is, in fact, the state is unable to be a client because he's not made for this. The city cannot be a client. So you have the developers, which we talked about, and you have the city, who cannot also not be a client. The private client has, so to speak, disappeared. So there is a huge battlefield, and you have the general contractors, and then you have the general planner. And we had to accept the role of general planner. We wanted to be just the architect, but we won this project without the competition and that's also interesting because it was a bottom-up decision. The people wanted this building because we made a sketch, we made really a brief thing, and people loved it so much that they wanted this project, and the mayor embarked on this kind of wave of enthusiasm, and they proposed it to the city, and it was clearly voted yes, we want it for a price which was ridiculous, and we were not involved in this kind of price. So everybody could see that this was from the beginning not possible to build it for less than 100 million euros. And the price now is, of course, much, much higher, but it's probably the right price for such a project. Now you can say, do we need such a project? Does Hamburg need such a project? They wanted it, and now, but that's too much discussion here. This triangle between the general planner, the general contractor, and the impossible client who delegated or outsourced this kind of role as a client to a private company. I mean, this is so, the traps, are so everywhere that it really for years and years this had to be cleaned up, and lawyers and armies of lawyers, and we were involved in this whole battle, and we had to do everything to free ourselves from that and not to completely go bankrupt, because there was a danger that we were sued or we were found guilty for responsible for whatever, because we had a sort of general planner contract. So we were responsible also, theoretically, but we had subcontracts and other contracts and legal advisors and whatever. We were also responsible for what the engineers did, the heater, the plumber, everybody, somehow. But we could not have a different contract, because because it was not a competition, we came in directly, and European law says if you have that kind of direct access, you have to be more than just the architect. You have to be the general planner. You have to deserve this. So we were really trapped in many ways. But if you lay this all out, it says so much about our society today, about how these things are interwoven and what the expectation is, because the expectation of the public about you as the architect is still that you are responsible for everything.
Yeah.
The door doesn't open, the window, every single detail, this is the architect, which is great. We are just still looked at like generalists, but in fact we are more in a very small corner where we really can take the responsibility. And here we are again with this issue of liability and the impossibility to be an architect, and young people here, especially in this country, where liability issues are even worse than in Europe, make it so difficult for this business to survive. So this is in fact a very long, complex thing.
I wanted to echo what Jacques was saying. We've had the same problem in Spain.
Right.
When we started the project, it was a beautiful idea by the president of a downtrodden region. They were losing people by the thousands, and young people wouldn't stay there, and it was the poorest region of Spain. So he wanted to build a cultural center. We were chosen in a competition against all the big monkeys at the time. And we won the competition, and then the client kept adding. They wanted more. In other words, the library was originally supposed to be 500,000 books. The culture minister said, no, it's got to be 1 million books. They don't have 1 million books, but it had to be for 1 million books. So that clearly the price changed. And now people are saying we're the cause of the Spain's crisis. We're not the cause. I mean,
you had to. I understand you had to go to trial for this too, right?
pardon?
You had to testify.
Oh, yeah, I had to testify. I mean, if anybody thinks that the architect sets the price or tells the client this is what it should cost, they're totally wrong. Our clients told us what they wanted, how much they could spend, and as a matter of fact, 10 years ago, they had the money, they had issued all the contracts, they were coming in at the cost that they wanted. It was political decisions to delay certain contracts, et cetera. That's why it's not finished today. Right. But I would agree with Jacques that in today's world, to do a civic project with the pressures on society the way they are, to do architecture is, I think, a very difficult occupation. And I would also, just let me add one thing, this question of sustainability. We were just in a competition where 40% of the jury's grading was on sustainability. In a climate where the client itself said sustainability is impossible, okay? They wanted a zero tolerance. And of course, you know, it's not that we won or lost on the basis of that, but to be judged on something which I think is extra architectural, that costs a lot of money. I mean, I'm not convinced, by the way, as I'm not convinced of bottom-up thinking, I'm not convinced that sustainability gets you very far, especially with solar panels and whatever. I think they're more expensive than what they do. But I couldn't agree more that it's a bad time for architecture. And the reason is that no one has figured out a way to allow late capital to provide for the social services that are necessary today in any country. In other words, and what happens is this bottom-up thinking is the top guys pass down to the local communities, oh, it's your responsibility, and these local communities are going belly up because they can't afford to maintain the roads, et cetera. They can't afford, I mean, New Haven is a great example. The tax base of New Haven cannot sustain the schools, the social services, all of those kinds of hospitals, police force, et cetera, and therefore you get a certain kind of chaos. Ithaca is much simpler in a certain way than New Haven, but New Haven can't exist in the form that it's in. It has to either gobble up communities in order to sustain its tax base, or to cut back on social services. And cutting back on social services means cutting back on the iconography which is important to society that architecture represents. In other words, all societies need to leave marks on the ground. And I think that's why we do what we do. Today, it's more and more difficult.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just to, I totally agree with the sustainability thing. I think that whole discussion has to change somehow, because if architects really cared about the environment or sustainability, then they wouldn't be building buildings, right? Architecture is the single most polluting industry in the world. So
Maybe I can add something, because this, I think, is very important for the young audience here. What can one do? Because we are in that situation of late capitalism that is making it so difficult to bring jobs to young people and small things. And I think we should start with this campus. It's a shame that this campus is being developed by such bad architects and such ugly buildings. It can't be, because this is such a tremendous chance. And I said this morning when we talked to the students, why don't you try? And I think the young Japanese architects do that much better. They find niches in the cities where they build just their stuff, small houses, whatever. And even if you do small houses, at least you do something. You don't work just for any anonymous firm in New York or wherever. And the campus should be claimed back as a field of expression, of intellectual exchange and architectural criticism. And the buildings that are being built here would be an ideal field. Yeah. And I think that's something where the professors, the teacher, cannot claim being innocent and have nothing to do with this. I think that would be political, if I'm compared to the 60s and 70s. I think that would be important to claim that right back. So it's very concrete, actually.
Wait, Jacques, I want to agree with you and suggest that there isn't a bone in most of these people's bodies that resonates with the 60s and 70s, with 68. They don't want to take back. They want to be given, right? There's a society, I believe, of enablers, of entitlers, and I couldn't get my students to, we have the same problem at Yale. Don't forget the business school that's being built, the Bob Stearns dormitories, I mean, unbelievable. But no one is going to say woo about anything, because it's not the time. Right. And I don't think we should put on these people the necessity of activism, because it's not in the moment in time. I mean, you may and I may have a nostalgia about that moment when they burned the Yale Architecture School down, but they did. It ain't the time.
I mean, you said something that really resonated about, terror and revolution brings about change in architectural paradigm. Yeah. And you listed the French Revolution, the two World Wars, 68, 9/11. But if you see now, I mean, we don't even fight wars with people anymore. It's drones, and then you see the NSA, and then all right, well, so what? No one doesn't really seem to care. I don't think it's not the time. I think it's a completely different sensibility altogether, in which we're no longer moved by terror and destruction. That architectural paradigms won't be changing through these kind of big shifts anymore. But going back to kind of what you guys said, in terms of Elbphilharmonie and Santiago de Compostela, it's basically the critique of the star architect system, right? Yep. That somehow the system that perpetuated, that made it so famous architects now are people that build museums and concert halls. They're not people that care about housing. They're not people that think about cities in kind of humanist ways, and they're very large corporations that build concert halls and museums. How do we fix that?
Well, you know something? First of all, I don't know an architect that would turn down a commission to do a public housing project, right? We're not asked to do it because the agencies don't think they need architects to do what we're talking about. So I don't think that there are ways to fix anything ever. Things evolve the way they are. I mean, as Jacques was saying last night, and I thought it was a very poignant moment, where he said things were great in the 60s, and then suddenly, boom, 68, out of nowhere came 68, and you say to yourself, looking back, why did 68 happen? In other words, because we were in an era of prosperity, why was there 68? And until we can find out why these things happen, I don't think we can set off a time bomb and say, hey, you guys, let's have a rally tonight and go out. They look at you and say, "What are you, nuts?" I mean, so I'm not too worried about I don't have time to fix those kinds of problems, by the way. I got lots of things I want to do. I love teaching. I've been teaching longer than any other practicing architect in the world, consecutively. And I think what disturbs me, I think I have, but I'm older than you are. I think that what is, for me, disturbing is with all the teaching one does, where are my students? Have I done anything for the world, right? And I think, in a certain way, if I really wanted to face that, maybe I'm not a very good teacher. Maybe it's impossible to teach architecture. I don't know. I would like to think that there would be more people around who were motivated in different ways, and I don't see that, by the way, out of my students. So when you ask me, has there been a president who has been interested in public housing that has hired somebody other than to do their presidential library, left or right president, Democrat or Republican, that's ever hired anybody to do public housing? Ed Logue hired architects to do public housing. John Lindsay hired architects to do public housing. But that was in 50 years ago. Have there been other people? And I think that's where we're in, because the problems are different. The problems that Lindsay and Ed Logue faced were not as late capital as they are today. Yeah. And so Carson, even though I think it's a very valid question, I think the question should be addressed to all of these people, because Jacques and I have our own problems, being former star architects who are really in disrepute, by the way, and you're right about that we didn't choose to be star architects, and star architects is not a good thing anymore, that I can tell you. It's better to be unknown and not be expert. So I think the job of teaching today is more difficult in the climate that we're in. There are more things to learn, more technological things, more possibilities of social interaction brought about by the built environment. So what can I say? Go ahead. Sure. I didn't. Let's have some questions.
Well, given a certain amount of nostalgia about the 60s, recently I saw a list in the New Yorker where one of the things a critic asked is, that curators might do is to not refer every show to the 60s. This is one of his because I have to think about well, not 60s, early 70s show that you curated, to which you had invited Gordon Mata Clark, who then proceeded to blow out the window of the gallery, to which you reacted in this way, which you sort of suggest you don't really approve of, which is
Not sort of suggest, I didn't approve of somebody bringing a gun into this, and I'm against guns in public.
okay. So it was done. If he had done it with a stone, it would have been okay.
Much different than, yes, sir. You can do it with a stone, you want to break a window with a stone, but this was a repeater rifle and shot out all the windows. You'd have to have a lot of stones with him, and no one was going to go near him when he had a rifle. That I can tell you, and say, hey, why don't you not do that? I think it was a really ugly gesture. I still would argue that. And I'm not for arming artists any more than I am for arming teachers or students to go into public places where there were hundreds of people and shoot out the windows as a gesture. No, I think there's a big difference.
And he did this when there were hundreds of people in there?
Yeah, there were hundreds of people. Absolutely, I was there. Literally hundreds of people. And we were absolutely horrified when it started. That I can tell you. But the reason why it was done, John, is that Gordon Matta Clark hated architects. He hated Colin Rowe. He hated Peter Eisenman. When I say hate, he had a dislike, and he was going to manifest that dislike. All of those years of holding back from Ithaca to New York, and he did. And I can't applaud that.
Right. Well, I guess I'm trying to connect it to the project that he was proposing, which had to do with a kind of critique of public housing.
Yeah.
And public housing had this image of something that's been neglected with the windows shot out. So there was a kind of, there was a kind of conceptual clarity to the gesture, aside from how you might have read it, and aside from, I didn't know he did it while there were people there. But to me, that seems like a really radical act, and I understand.
It was.
I wasn't aware of the fact that I knew he did it with a rifle. I didn't know he did it while people were there. But still, that I understand the problem with it, but it seems to me that it adds a kind of clarity to the critique. So the response.
It was a very
I
clear
wasn't there.
critique.
Pardon?
There was no question, it was clear. But what you're upset about is not his critique, my reaction to it. That's what you don't like.
Well, your reaction, as I wasn't there, so I've only read about it, was to link this to Kristallnacht, right? That
To
you
what?
said Kristallnacht. When the
Yeah,
the
I
talks
said,
in
yeah,
Berlin
I
were-
said this is a place of peace, not of violence. And I said it was too much for me as a Jew, representative of shooting out windows, the symbolic thing, like the House of Deutsche Kunst. And I said, I can't permit that here, okay? Now, whether Matta Clark was aware of that or concerned about that, I don't care. You weren't going to do that in this place. And he was ushered out, not cheered, okay? Now, do I have a nostalgia for Matta Clark? I think in that case, no. I'm not, no, but I'm saying that I do have a nostalgia for architects, which we did, public housing, for John Lindsay and for Ed Logue. I do have a nostalgia for a time when we were involved in those kinds of socially relevant projects that were built, and we built some of our social housing. And don't forget, Jacques and I, he looks at the 60s as a distant viewer. I was there. He was a kid. So there's a difference.
I think he was in school, which was very different. Be in school during that time, like late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
Then, which are really formative years, than to have been in your position. You were basically a mature architect at that point.
In the Yale School of Architecture when they burned it down.
Well, maybe I say something about that.
Yeah.
I believe that and I can only repeat myself that the artists of that time, including especially Gordon Matta Clark, who I believe is an extremely interesting artistic figure, had the radicality, a radical approach. I don't make a nostalgia for a revolution or uprise, whatever, but just the way they use that act of destruction, which at first sight seems very negative, but in fact has a very freeing side to it also. It was leading them and others towards something really new, whereas in architecture, and that's what he hated, and I also must say that I don't think that Colin Rowe or Ungers or these guys who were hanging around here were leading or were opening up a path, but it was directly leading in a dead end. And Matta Clark was right. And I also didn't like that. That's why we tried to find another path. And we found it rather in association with the thinking of artists of that time. That is not, in my case, a nostalgia or whatever. It's just trying to bring that back for the generation of today. And by the way, I agree with what you said, Peter, about the young generation. You cannot change that. I don't want them to do revolution because they have a different mind, they have a different awareness, and so it is what it is. But if you want to change something in your biography or in your lives, you have to think about what could that be and where is the possibility to find a niche to do that. And I very much like young people who try to do this in ideally a peaceful way. You know,
Okay.
and I think that what you did, you left the country, you went to Berlin, you tried to find niches in a way that very few do in your generation. And I think there should be more of those initiatives. And whether we as teachers, I'm also teaching students, can help with this. And when you say, where are my students? You know, I mean, Vlad was not a student, but it was one of yours. So he went, made a very interesting, path. And so there are possibilities, I think.
I didn't say they weren't. I've been waiting. I was hoping you'd bring the ball up that you threw up last night. I cannot throw Matthias Ungers and Colin Rowe under the bus for the name of Gordon Matta Clark. I have to tell you that there never were, in the late 60s and early 70s, a more influential group of people. Both Ungers as an architect, I think was one of the most important radical architects in Germany in the early 60s, and that Colin Rowe was one of the great historian critics of the last half of the 20th century, along with Peter Banham and Manfredo Tafuri, who and I have his book here to inspire me. And I think that to treat Matta Clark in one way and then to say that Rowe and Ungers were a dead end, I think is not really the case. And I don't think, I think Rowe and Ungers were, Cornell was the place to be when Rowe and Ungers were here. That's why Rem came, that's why Leon came. I mean, all of our friends came here to be with them. And the fact that they didn't get along or disagreed or whatever, Colin never wrote a goddamn book. I mean, he just taught students. He couldn't be without students. Ungers may have never done a good building. His early houses were, I thought, stunning in the late 50s that were in Zodiac magazine, in the two houses in Cologne. But I think Ungers and Rowe were really important figures in their world. And I think if we were to look back 100 years from now, are going to seem more important than Matta Clark's career here. That's all I want to. I don't want to dismiss, like you did last night, as a dead end,
Okay.
Roe and
Okay,
Ungers.
but if you look back in history, maybe it's too early, and you see what the Smithson and Gordon Matta Clark and his generation of artists have done.
Smithson's different than Gordon Matta
Yeah, but
Clark.
nevertheless, he was also here, no? And he was also
Yeah.
he was also one of these possible sources to find new paths in architecture. That's what I meant. And when I said dead, I don't mean this personally, but it didn't lead anywhere in architecture. Whereas Gordon Matta Clark and Smithson and others of their generation find new ways that are still fresh today, which is clearly not the case if you think of Colin Rowe's ideas about transparency. I mean, who cares about that? And also Ungers, I agree that very early houses are really interesting, and later he lost the path, and that's not that. There must be a reason behind of that. I'm not trying to kill people retrospectively or whatever. I'm just trying to find that time back to see, what are possible ways you go. And when I said collaborations and myths, this was about why did we do those collaborations? It was for us a necessity. So I just can speak from my own biography. And probably I would rather have gone with Gordon Matta Clark than with Matthias Ungers or with Colin Rowe.
But I think, look, even to this day, the world of thought dealing with painting and sculpture is far more advanced than the world of thought dealing with architecture. And I mean, all you have to do is read the people in the New York Times who are at the low end of the scale, like Roberta Smith, etc. Even they have Michael Kimmelman, who is an art critic doing architecture now. And we don't even have architecture in the fall preview anymore because the Times doesn't think about it. So what we're talking about, the public debate about architecture and public criticism is nowhere matched. We don't have an art forum. We don't have an Art in America. We don't have Basel biennales. The Biennale of Architecture is really a trade show. It's not anything of interest compared to the Art Biennale. And so we're talking about apples and bananas, and architecture, as far as I'm concerned, has struggled to try and find a discipline that is relevant to the world. And you would agree that the world of painting today is probably as mute as architecture is. I mean, there's no question that where postmodern painting is gone is down the tubes. But you have a nostalgia for a period of Smithson and Judd, etc. I grew up with those guys. You didn't necessarily. I grew up with those guys. I want to leave it at that. I don't want to start because they weren't nice guys personally. I mean,
We all are.
But maybe as we now open up for some questions, just a quick response to what you said. Why is it though that your average person will have a favorite movie, favorite film, or they'll have something to say about music?
because
Um,
people
they'll have,
live
they'll-
in
they even have favorite books,
Carson.
but people don't talk about architecture the same way.
because
Why is that?
people live in architecture, think they know what architecture is, right? And they don't. Number one, people go to school in architecture, they go to church in architecture, they go to business in architecture, they work in architecture. That doesn't mean that they go to restaurants too, but doesn't mean they're chefs. And what I'm saying is we have to overcome the perception with students that they understand what people know when they go and study music or literature. They don't know how to do that, right? And they're able to understand quickly the difference between literature and pulp novels. They're able to understand the difference between good music and not so, and pop music, let's say. And I think that they're not as easily able to understand the difference between architecture and building. And I think there's an enormous weight that we have to overcome because kids paint when they're little, they write when they're little, they sing when they're little. but they don't do architecture when they're little. So architecture is a second discipline as opposed to something very natural for kids. And so I think there's a big difference.
So questions?
Question here. I actually wanted to ask both of you, what do you think the future of an architect as a public intellectual really is, especially for this generation? It seems to me that in your fascinating discussion, somehow the 60s and the 70s sort of are still at a high ceiling of, you know, being active and being in disagreement and sort of making the practice in kind of ways of being political. But what would you think? And also the part of that is that both of you have worked with philosophers, with Derrida, with Georges Agamben, with Jean-Paul Chevrier, in case of Jacques. So would you think of any of those ways of working, again, with literally people at this particular moment as a sort of a third way or an exit from this kind of situation of impasse?
It's collaboration the third way.
No, first of all, I don't usually think about the future. I think about the present, I have to tell you. I find the collaboration as, let's say, a public intellectual or as a teacher, I love the collaboration that I have with other disciplines at the university. I have collaboration with the German department, with the Comp Lit department, because I think they're important. With the film department, I'm always been collaborating with other people all my life. So I think anybody who is a mature individual will want to collaborate either through reading, participating in some way with other disciplines. I think it's a very enriching experience. What I hate about architecture schools, where did he go? I hate about architecture schools is they seem cut off from the rest of the university, at least down at Yale, they seem to be. I mean, I have 2 students in my studio who are graduate students who don't know the difference between humanism and the Enlightenment. Now, if you don't know the difference between humanism and the Enlightenment, you really can't understand the difference between the architectures that those 2 philosophic and social episteme, let's say, produced. And if you don't understand that, you can't understand why the architecture radically changed. But and then if you don't understand humanism to Enlightenment, you ain't going to understand Enlightenment to modernism. And then you're not going to understand where you are today. So I think there's an enormous amount of education that has to go on for an architect beyond becoming expert at being an architect. And part of becoming an expert is understanding what these other discourses are about, I think. We don't, in the architecture curriculum, have enough time for kids to take look, Nabokov was here when I was here. I couldn't take Nabokov because I couldn't qualify for the level of English and writing that you needed to do. There are always great professors here outside of the discipline, and I think we don't open up to those disciplines, and I think what makes architecture ultimately a narrow discourse is the fact that there are not enough possibilities to open to other disciplines when we're in school. That would be I would love to see, I am totally against, I was at Cornell, I graduated, and I knew one thing when I graduated, that I didn't know anything. And that was the best thing that Cornell taught me, right? All the other stuff you could throw away. And then I started learning. Now if a university can do that, that's fabulous, okay? And I think it's too early for me as an 18-year-old to study architecture. I think you should study history, philosophy, economics, sociology, whatever, whatever other disciplines exist, and then go to graduate school. I mean, that's my gut feeling after having been involved in both. And I, let's put it this way. What's changed in the world, when I got out of school as a B.Arch, meant something in the world. I went to work for Walter Gropius. I went to work for Marcel Breuer. I went to work for, you know, the world was different, right? Today, you get out with a Bachelor of Architecture degree, and the one thing that frees you from Marcel Breuer and Walter Gropius and Peter Eisenman and Jacques Herzog is to be able to have a master's degree so you can teach, right? You can't teach anymore with a bachelor's degree, or not very much, okay? And teaching is the way you get out from under. It's the way I got out from under. I think the way Rem got out from under, the way a lot of people got out from under, is to be able to teach, because you cannot be a drone in an office forever. And without a master's degree, legislated by society, you can't move. So the 5-year degree, to me, is a problematic degree. It's condemning very good people to a kind of servitude for longer than if they had a 4.2 or a 4.3 situation. So I think the problem for everybody in this room is in this room, honestly. And a lot of things could be done to change that right away without losing the spirit of a 4-year undergraduate Cornell degree. And honestly, when I went to Cornell, going 4.5 hours to Ithaca was about as far as you could go in the world anyway. I was thinking on the bus today, when my 4.5-hour bus trip, I could be in London at the end of the trip instead of at Judd Falls Road. You know, I've been here before, right? But it's different because I can go to Los Angeles, I can go to London, I can go to Mexico City in 4.5 hours. So the question about being in Ithaca, which was amazing, and I still bleed carnelian, even though nobody knows what the real color is in this room but me. All right. You know what it is? Where do you see it every day?
On my sweatshirts.
What? You know what? I'll tell you what it is. I'm just, because it's some trivia. In 1903, Cornell was playing Pennsylvania on Thanksgiving Day, and the president of Campbell's Soup went to the game. He was from New Jersey. He was from Camden, New Jersey. He had gone to Princeton, and they had orange and black cans, okay? And he saw these red shirts on the Cornell team, and he said, "My God, that's an amazing red. No one has that red," which no one did. It's called carnelian. And he ordered all his cans to be changed from orange and black to carnelian. So if you want to know what carnelian is and what the color is, I don't know, Don, if you're, go down to whatever, Wegmans. You'll see a lot of carnelian. And that's the real color. Yeah.
I want to ask you a more serious question. And I am also a relic of the 1960s. So I have gone through the same things that you did and how Jacques was educated. And my Bible then was the Whole Earth Catalog. Remember that?
Yep.
By Stuart Brand. And you asked the question on why architects aren't hired for housing. And I think I would first make a suggestion and then ask you how to solve the problem. We certainly have global warming. I am not a Tea Party member. And we also have a drastic need to make green buildings, of which very few are on this campus, and none of the LEED rating buildings are really green buildings, which is a sad statement. Maybe thanks to John Osborne, who's also proved that if he's here. But 72% of the energy use in the United States goes either to the built environment or the electricity in the built environment. 80% of the built environment, which will exist in India in 2030, has not yet been built. It's going to start.
Okay.
China is polluting the globe, and we're going to all suffer from it. Why is it that the AIA and architects, and even architecture schools, are not teaching more about how to design buildings so they'll be more conservative in their energy use? And in fact, what could the universities do about it? What could star architects do about it? And what could schools do about it? And it's a serious problem which will open the doors to all of the young students in this office before the field is taken over more by developers.
I think your question is an accurate one and an important one, but you're addressing it to the wrong person. I'm on your side. I may not be able to teach sustainability, but I understand its role in the curriculum and why it's important to disciplinary issues. But I don't run a school. I don't run a university. I'm not an admissions director. I'm just an architect who teaches. So can an architect who teaches do anything? No, I don't honestly think so right now. I think.
But Peter, you can. I mean, I'm sure in the bachelor program there is a lot of teaching about sustainability, energetic issues, and environmental issues. I think that's normal in every school, also in America, I guess. Even if America,
here, that guy.
okay, even if America should do more than it does, but energy is cheap in America, and that's why it didn't happen. That's why also air conditioning was invented in America. I mean, that's a long story, and it's a cultural thing. In Europe, this is much more normal, and potentially, or basically every building we do is an environmentally sustainable building now. Also, it starts with what the walls are, where you put the windows. I didn't speak about that yesterday, but I think it's in fact a natural thing. Plus, the laws will change worldwidely in a way that you are not allowed not to do buildings which are not sustainable. And this leads to even more ugly architecture, by the way, because very few architects can handle this, and some of those laws are so stupid, they are against the human beings. You know, you cannot open the window anymore because you can only, anyway, that's another story. It's so whatever we do, and somehow that's a sad message, our hands are more and more bound, and we are more and more restricted in whatever we do, and this is leading to less and less interesting architecture. So the question, what will be in the future and what is the role of the young people here, is really a serious one, but we don't have an answer, to be very honest. But to think like an architect and to raise interesting questions involves criticism. And if this generation isn't critical, and that's more important than political in how my understanding is not being ideological, but being an open-minded person. And that's fundamental for whatever you do in your life.
I want to just, and Don, this may be Peter Eisenman nostalgia. I think the Dome of Sibley is a very special place. And it used to be when after I was here a little bit, not when I was in Whitehall, which was not a very special place. But the architecture was moved to a more special place, Sibley, then White. Architecture moved up the iconic ladder. And to me, what is the symbolic heart of an architecture school? Well, I think two things. One is the drafting room and one is the library. I think they're interconnected in some way. but the library is now in Rand Hall, right? And their office is up in Sibley. And I think to myself, is something wrong with that? And that may be nostalgia, right? But the Dome of Sibley is an incredible place. And I would begin by suggesting that the library doesn't belong in Rand is in a utilitarian building. It's fantastic. The shop is extraordinary. I would put all those facilities over there and move what was in the Dome back. If those things aren't important to the students and to the people who have these buildings, then we're never going to get better buildings at Cornell. We're never going to get people who mind those kinds of problems. And I think that's an answer to your question, that right around them in this environment are problematic situations that should be, I think, debated at least.
Do we have time for one more question, or?
Can I ask a question? We were talking about sustainable architecture development. Do you think that development of sustainable architecture has changed architects' freedom, has put it in a frames and changed, became more technical rather than more like creative, and architect has less freedom now?
The technical part of sustainability is boring and is easy. Sooner or later you can do that. You can buy it, yeah, like you have electricity, so your solar panels, whatever. The question is what you do out of this and what you do besides passively. And that has always been a role of architecture, you know, and that is not subject, or that's not making you less free. But what really will diminish that kind of freedom is what I said before, which is when the laws are changing in a way that you cannot do a building with a certain amount of glass which is operable, for instance. I mean, that's when really it starts to be against human beings. For instance, before I book a room in a hotel anywhere, especially when I travel to Asia, but also in America, I make sure the windows are operable, which very often they are not. But me, it's fundamental condition for my for the quality of my sleep, my night, that I can at least a little bit open the window. And I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but that's what where architecture starts. So architecture impacts our lives very much. Not so much we as designers are being impacted negatively, but it's our lives. And that's why we have to be sure that whatever we make to make the world safer and environmentally better, politically correcter, doesn't kill what we call human and what we like so much about life.
But how do you, here's a problem for both. Let's say we both agree on what you're saying. Leon Krier would say that we're hypocrites, that what he says you have to do to get into those kinds of conditions of passive situations of solar gain, etc., is to build in stone, to build massively, to build classically, etc., not to use modern materials, etc. How do we answer Leon Krier, who's one of the most violent critiques, saying that he is really interested and we are not?
I mean, I think that certainly one answer is what he says, but that's a rather conservative attitude. I think that modernity also went in some way in a wrong direction, but it's not this or that. I think that architecture must give the answer in every single project. And solid walls can be interesting, but super thin and glazy and transparent walls as much. So again, it's, you know, I'm not ideological about this. We should just do whatever is necessary, and what is important makes a good building. And clearly, I mean, if you can't do a window anymore in a building just because you lose energy, I mean, what's the point? But I don't think this is the way. So maybe, you know, one field is, and that's why Peter is perhaps right, before you go to architecture, study physics or economy to be fit to answer those questions, because then fundamentally through giving laws and impact in the society in different fields, you have a stronger impact on architecture than if you go through design.
I think we have time for one last question. Oh,
You stand up and face that way, or we get a mic. Go ahead.
He talked about teaching and students and how it's become more difficult in today's climate. How do you think students have changed? Have they kept up with this change, or I'm curious how the questions have changed with time.
Well, I think first of all, the notion of the entitled student. We've all heard about it, but they are compared to the students of the '60s that when I first started teaching are very different. They really are. I mean, you could get anybody in a group of students together to go out and protest anything in the '60s. Very hard to get students to protest anything, honestly, today. There's too much satisfaction with what they are receiving from their entitlements. I mean, if we look at Cooper Union, which is one of the most radical schools in the '50s and '60s, the students believe that they're entitled to a free education, that they shouldn't have to pay tuition because they're a special elite cadre and someone should pay for them. I think that's a bunch of junk. We all pay for education, and we have to pay for it in order to be of a certain value. You have to give something in order to get something back. But what's interesting, the most radical students I know, which are at Cooper Union, are complaining about paying tuition. Now, that's a really strange thing to be complaining about. And everybody else in every other institution pays tuition. And so I think there's a sense of entitlement. I mean, they occupied the president's office for 3 weeks there because they had to pay tuition. That's a very strange thing to be radical about, I think. I don't think we're in the time of a moment of radical behavior in Western capital. I think that the loss of a certain sovereignty, the loss of a certain mobility that the society has, there's no question that my son, when he went to school in New York, was able to go to a better school than he's able to send his son to. And that's a really strange phenomenon that I did better than my parents, and my generation did better than their parents in a sense. I'm not convinced that this generation is going to be able to do better than their parents. I'm not convinced of that. That's what I mean by late capital, that the system doesn't operate in the same in terms of medical insurance, et cetera, all the kinds of things that no one ever thought about. They were just part of the fabric.
It's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. So I think there are a lot of big issues that face people growing up in this country, and that we don't have many answers for. And we don't have, I mean, the clowns running for mayor of New York is an example. I mean, to me, what gave them the right to run for mayor? I mean, what about their experience, their being, what about their policies? In fact, the only one that articulated policies to me was Anthony Weiner, who had a lot of great ideas. He was the wrong messenger.
And maybe, Peter, I just had a little thing. We cannot answer this, but you didn't finish. I mean, we didn't finish your question about fascism and then China and other questions. I mean, the question is, what's the role of democracy in this world? And if we look back at history, there is just a minute of democracy in the whole time span. What are the upcoming cultures? China, Arab countries, Russia, they're all but democratic. What are we asking Syria to be democratic, Libya to be democratic, Egypt to be democratic? Yeah. It's impossible. We cannot go into these countries and bring them what we believe is right, because this is our end and is also not bringing democracy any further. But honestly, this is also then quite a question: what comes after, or what is then, let's say, a right system, a good system to change? Because we cannot give the answer here. But I think, if as an architect, and that's maybe certainly an interesting part of our business, it's a very holistic, very archaic discipline, and you can measure a lot of the things that happen in the world through how this is changing as a business, and what you experience in all these countries that you have projects, because you witness total differences in cultural differences about energy, about sustainability, about relationship between client and architect and society. And it's true that the bottom up that I find so important to make the things right, not for moral reasons, but for my buildings to be good buildings, is not that I believe that I would like to give up the top down, because otherwise you lose the control. But how can you mix that? Because even if you do top down and you have a non-democratic government giving you all the freedom to do something, maybe this doesn't produce a good building. But the purely or sheerly bottom up ones also don't really produce that automatically. So we are left, wherever we work, up to somehow also our intuition and our understanding what people want and need. Whatever the system is, people are not so different here and there. And I mean, that would certainly lead to another discussion, and also what I said about the books, could be said about politics. What are the political conditions which are ideal for us to produce better, or the ideal political situation for good architecture? I don't know how good architecture is that has been produced in democracies compared to non-democratic systems.
I think that you find, I would like to argue that the difference between a republic and a democracy is very important. In a republic, leaders are elected and they make decisions. In a democracy, leaders are elected and the other people make decisions. They don't stand by that. In other words, I've found this in any number of democratic situations that I find. I've also found that the most buildings that I have done have been for Republican administrations, even though I'm a lifelong Democrat. So I asked the question, why is that? I think that group decision-making doesn't lead to good architecture, nor good planning, nor whatever. And usually the people that I've dealt with at the top in what I would call left, right of center administrations are seemingly willing to take risks and do things that people on the left of center are not. I don't know the reason for that, and there's a real disturbance in my own career because I've always voted left, and I get work from the right.
Peter,
yeah.
you're going to miss your bus.
What?
You're going to miss your bus.
No, I'm not going to miss my, it's 5 o'clock.
And it's 5:40
What?
is your bus.
What time is it right now?
It's 5.
Yeah.
So we should begin to wrap up and bring
Okay,
you over to the
sorry.
other side.
I tell you what, I'd love to come back. I always come back for hockey games. It would be nice to come back for architecture. Thank you very much.
What I...
Good. It was good. I'll tell the guy to get
on the wooden floor upstairs are some refreshments. Feel free to carry on the conversation. But thank you all very much for coming, and thanks to Peter, Jacques, and Carson, and Vlad in the front row.